You're an agribusiness executive navigating an increasingly competitive market while trying to grow your company. Mergers and acquisitions are pitched as an accelerant to growth, but many M&A deals destroy more value than they create. Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches for successful mergers and acquisitions. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosher.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod. I'm your host, Joe Mosher, and I'm really happy that you chose to spend your time with us today. Today, I'm joined by Jeff Blair, who's the president and the CEO of Greenpoint AG. Greenpoint AG, we're going to talk a little bit more about here in a moment, but they're a leading farmer-owned agronomy retailer that serves farmers and member farmer-owned co-ops across the southern United States. Jeff is a very unique guy, way more experience than years on the planet would suggest. But he's a former U.S. Army captain. He served 8 years in Special Forces and military intelligence. He's a former attorney. And despite all those years of service, he also has a long tenure in agribusiness as well, which we're going to leverage all of that today. He's got a lot of perspectives, lots of great experiences. In his agribusiness background, Jeff most notably and recently served as president of the Plant Nutrient Group at the Andersons. And prior to that, he led the sales and marketing organization of Intrepid Potash. Jeff also currently serves on the Agricultural Retailers Association Board of Directors in addition to his responsibilities at Greenpoint. We're going to get more into Jeff's background and journey in a bit more later here. I want to stop here and say, Jeff, welcome to the Pacesetter Pod.
Great. No, thank you, Joe. Appreciate it. And thanks for having me today. Excited for the conversation.
Yeah. And just for the folks listening in, Jeff's our first ever returning guest. We recorded a fantastic episode that is lost to the internets because of a connectivity issue halfway through the recording that corrupted the files. So this is actually round 2. That was a dress rehearsal. So this should be good things coming.
Yeah, we certainly hope so.
No, thanks for coming back.
Absolutely.
So I want to start off by just giving listeners a little bit of an overview of Greenpoint. Earlier this year, Greenpoint was named one of the Big 7 by CropLife, which puts you in company with Nutrien, CHS, Helena, Growmark, Wilbur Ellis, and Simplot. But, size is not a very good proxy for the story and doesn't really tell you all that much about the company. So let's start off by having you tell us, who Greenpoint AG is and what you all do.
Sure, absolutely. If you think about where the SEC plays football, that's kind of where Greenpoint is. So from Texas up to Kentucky, we're not yet in South Carolina, but other than that, we're sort of in the SEC. And you can tell by my funny accent, I am not from the Southeast U.S. We moved here about 3.5 years ago when Greenpoint started. But, going back to an egg retailer, obviously anything that farmers really need from a supply side, egg input side to grow their crops. We also focus heavily on services. Greenpoint's, it's a little unique in that we've got both company-owned retail stores, about 90 of them across the Southeast. And then we also are a wholesaler to our cooperative owner members in Alabama Farmers Cooperative and Tennessee Farmers Cooperative. So they've got about 150 other retail locations really throughout Alabama, a little bit into North Florida and into Tennessee with some stuff up into Kentucky and a few into Virginia and the like. But for the most part, it's focused around the Southeast all in. That's really our focus. So we're proud to be number 7 on the CropLife 100, but we're really regionally focused versus some of the guys above us that are really much more national in scope.
So tell us a little bit about how Greenpoint came to be in terms of the origin story.
Sure. Greenpoint, right in the middle of the pandemic, the perfect time for a merger, of course, right in the middle of COVID, really decided to bring 3 companies together. It was really Agra AFC, which was, again, sort of a wholesaler and retailer in cooperative with Alabama Farmers Cooperative and Winfield United. And then there was Tennessee Farmers. And then there was what I call the Legacy Greenpoint, which was a joint venture between Winfield and Tennessee Farmers Cooperative. So really our 3 major owners are Tennessee Farmers Cooperative, Alabama Farmers Cooperative, and Winfield United, i.e. Land O'Lakes. But they all came together. All these came together in August of 2020. We really started actually in September of 2020 and have been going strong since. And then in the spring of 2022, we added TCFA, Tri-County Farmers Cooperative, and added them out of Arkansas. They had about 7 locations. So we added a 4th sort of partner to the mix here a little while ago and have been going strong ever since.
Yeah, I look forward to the book that you write one day, Jeff, on what is it like to start a quasi-startup, quasi-incumbent, 3 legacy businesses, 1 new business, all in the midst of a global pandemic and what came to be some historic supply chain constraints. So I know your long lessons from the last several years.
Yeah, there was plenty of lessons. I think part of it is a little bit of, maybe it's an advantage of being so new at it. We didn't have sort of this concept of normal, right? So our version of normal was all the stuff that was happening around the pandemic and then the supply chain, and everybody was trying to figure out what to do every day. In some sense, the pressure comes off because what you're really focused on is immediately what's in front of you. And really proud of the team that was just like, okay, here's the issue today. Let's go ahead and let's work on solving that. Okay, what's the next issue that shows up? Let's work on solving that. I joke, it wasn't much of a joke, but we put everybody on the same ERP system about 60 days into it. And about 30 days later, I sent the board a note and I said, well, here's the balance sheet. I said, the good news is we are transacting and we know we haven't lost anything. The bad news is I can only send you a balance sheet and we think it balances in most material respects. Please don't ask any questions because I have no other information for you. I'll be back next month. A month later, you send them the actual P&L that's about a page long. And I'm like, we now have P&L, still transacting. And I don't have a lot of detail beyond the basic P&L, but hey, life is good, And then, of course, 3 years later, we've got full Power BI suite. We've got it fully integrated. We brought everything together and know what the heck we're doing. But, you just start off and you start solving problems.
And you can probably only laugh in hindsight, kind of the idea of your first year, the strategic theme of the year is directionally correct, right, with all the information you're providing. And
yeah. I think the analogy we use is, right, the plane took off and then it was time to build the wings. But that's just a little bit of the nature of it. I think we all have a fantasy that everything is going to be smooth and we have this great plan and it's just going to go perfectly according to plan. And as they say in the Army, no battle plan ever survives the first shot. But if you don't have a plan, obviously you may not either. So you come in with a plan and then you just got to flex as you go. But again, the team was really, really good. And I think the focus on just solving what's in front of us one step at a time. And again, I think the nature of the pandemic might have actually helped us because it just threw everybody out of this concept of normal. And so there wasn't sort of these expectations about how it was supposed to go. And because we were so new, I think there was also just a level of sort of flexibility and, I don't know, the term I use would be grace among a lot of the employees, Not everything was perfect. And it was going. And the reality was for the ag industry that COVID was pretty good for us, right? I mean, crop prices were strong. Yes, supply was constrained for sure, and it was chaos, but we were still operating as an essential business and prices were strong and people were making money, and that will cover a fair amount of sins.
Yeah. So let's talk about that though. And it's something that I've been referring to as the tailwind problem. We did go through this period of time where in most parts of the ag supply chain, you had a lot of disruption, a lot of labor challenges. People were really dealing with personal matters at home, worrying about friends and family. Are we going to have enough toilet paper to make through the week? All this kind of early day stuff. But largely in our businesses, we benefited from some of that dislocation in the marketplace. And, while from a food or, think about a food manufacturing business, maybe you lost your retail events, your hotel, your airline business, restaurants, but then people were significantly overbuying their needs at a retail level for their homes, right? People significantly overbought their needs on a variety of things. And that kind of all accrued to a lot of opportunity for folks in the ag supply chain. And, we see it again, farmer incomes were strong, commodity values generally held their own. But with that, the problem with the upside is that it doesn't last forever. And we had a pretty good rip there of a couple of years. So it wasn't even like a seasonally cyclical thing where it's like after 2 years, expectations of how the market works starts to calcify and people kind of forget what a headwind feels like. And so that's the problem. So the tailwind problem is twofold. One, the good times don't last and you make money getting out of bed in the morning. And then the second half of it is it creates a little bit of comfort. And so it makes hard choices and big challenges a little less familiar. So how have you all experienced that at Greenpoint, having started in the midst of this big boom? And then I'm guessing, I don't know, but I'm guessing 23 hasn't exactly been the smoothest year for you guys.
Well, no, you've absolutely nailed it, right? Obviously, a wise man once said, never confuse brains with a bull market, right? And so you start off and you look like a genius because the market's going nuts and giving you all this stuff. And even in 2022, when the markets really took off, and you just have to remember, again, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it sent the fertilizer markets right in the beginning of spring into a whirlwind. And all of us were loaded up for bear to get ready for the spring. And, the value of that inventory went through the roof, which brings a lot of financial benefit to those of us in the supply chain. So you got all these tailwinds, right? And interest rates were really low at the time. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it felt great. And you feel like you look like a genius when I finally could get that balance sheet, it looked really good. Right? And so, yeah, life's great. And people are making money and everybody's like, this is great. So I think for us, the timing was really good in the sense that we had a lot of challenges and the tide was high and it covered up a lot of those barnacles and those rocks that were sitting under there. 2023, yeah, absolutely. Those tailwinds turned right into headwinds. Inflation obviously goes up through the roof. You've got falling commodity prices. You've got falling input prices. So all that inventory that was so great you were sitting on before, we knew it would come off and we tried to stay low. But a company of our size, if you said, hey, we're going to end and we're going to empty every single shed we have in our system, we probably would have still 50,000 tons of crop nutrients sitting there somewhere. And that's probably if you think you swept the corners of every shed. It's just a system. You have to have something to sell. And so if that system and the prices drop, you're going to face some very, very significant headwinds no matter what you do, right? Glyphosate came off from 60, probably dropped by 2/3. And that just causes pain in the system. So all that benefit you get to give back on the downside. But I think your point's the right one, which is I think when we look back at this from Greenpoint's perspective, we're going to say 2023 was a good year for us in that it got us refocused on the basics of business, right? You've got to get back to money is not free. When interest rates are 2% and 3%, you can borrow and capital is just free flowing. And is that the greatest thing for all of us? You can make some decisions that maybe in retrospect aren't great. It allowed us to be able to make some investments that we needed to make at a lower cost, but it then forces us to go back and have real conversations around what's the priority for capital? Where does it need to be deployed? Where does it not need to be deployed today? And then it forces us to be really disciplined in how we execute our business. And for us, that's around developing those systems and those processes and saying, how do we leverage the size and scale of Greenpoint to be able to become more efficient in our supply chain? Right. So fundamentally, the way I look at the retail market is that the retail is all about service. And that's what differentiates retailer is the service they provide to the growers. If you're on the wholesale side, it is all about efficiency. And yes, you've got to have the product and you've got to deliver it, but it's about you're a link in the supply chain and your goal should be to really reduce your cost to serve so that you can help your customers be more competitive in their space. So you've got a service component, which is more of a higher cost model on the retail side, and on the wholesale side, it's really an efficiency, logistics, supply chain play. And getting those two right within the same business is critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about that in the context of ag retail writ large. So much consolidation over the last, I don't know, you tell me, I'm going to say 20 years roughly. There's no start or a firm stop to that story. But in many ways, I've read some analyst reports and some commentary that suggested that a lot of the growth that we saw among some of the bigger names we mentioned earlier, much of that actually came out of its reflection of consolidation and inorganic growth rather than maybe some of the growth absent acquisition. And as a sector consolidates, the competitive dynamics change, which then changes all the opportunities and drivers for growth. And so I think what you're pointing at is we're not in a post-M&A world for ag retail, but I think we're in a post-M&A as a primary driver of growth environment for ag retail and getting good at the basics of the business. So if we're a services business, we're going to excel at providing excellent service, differentiated value in how we serve our producer and farmer customers. If we're wholesale, we're gonna run it's gonna be like a Daytona 500 pit crew. We know what to do. Everyone's got a job, and we execute flawlessly every single time. What are your thoughts on that? Outside of the operating efficiency and high level of service, are there other things that are likely to drive or inhibit growth in ag retail over the next 5 years, let's say?
Yeah, I think you have to start with the fact that we are in an industry that is a very mature industry in a very mature market. Obviously, people have been farming for a long time, and since sort of the dawn of civilization, if you will, right? And but so the industry is very mature. The U.S. market is very mature. We're not seeing growth in acreage out there. So where does that growth come from? And I think, in my mind, there's a couple of things that drive it. You obviously get consolidation, and so it drives your top line, it drives some of your bottom line. There's some efficiencies to scale, and I think there clearly is if you do it right. If you do it wrong, you can just add a lot of cost, right? I mean, we when Greenpoint's formed, you have to build a corporate headquarters, and you've got all the staff. You have to make sure that your efficiencies are going to more than make up for any of those additional complexity that you add at scale. As it relates to where we see growth besides sort of inorganic growth, and I don't really see that necessarily slowing down. I think the new interest rates, the new environment is going to put some pressure on some of these smaller folks out there if they're not managing their balance sheet, and they're going to look for some partners. While it is certainly a consolidated industry, if you look at other major industries out there, we still have a large number of players in the egg supply chain, relatively speaking, to other industries, right? If you just pull outside of the egg space. But getting back to your question around where does organic growth come from, in my mind, it really comes down to services. What is that egg retailer's relationship with that grower and their ability to service the growers, who, by the way, are growing and consolidating, at a fairly rapid pace? And I look at it on a couple of fronts. I think there's one is ag tech and agronomy. The technology that is being deployed on the farm today is really complicated. And we talk a lot about, AI and artificial intelligence and what that might bring. The promise of it right now is really high. The reality of it is it's really low because the stuff doesn't talk. So you've got one set of, equipment, John Deere Operations Center, they're trying to sort of bring and consolidate this together. We've got ways to consolidate together, but a grower really needs help to figure out that technology, right? And go back to your days when the VCR came back out. I'm dating myself, or any new technology comes out, right? You've got to figure out how to use it. And there's all of this technology, and all of it sort of wants to operate in and of by itself as its own silo. So if I have an electronic rain gauge that can remote sensing water in the fields, which is some pretty incredible technology, it feeds its own database. I've got a spreader truck, and how does it feeds another database. And then I've got all these other, my soil samples, and it feeds something. And how do you line all this stuff up, and you layer all the data and all the weather information and let AI go to work, or let smart folks that are a lot smarter than me, that have a lot better education in ag tech and agronomy, go to work on this stuff to provide real insights to the grower. My days as a military intelligence guy, we talked a lot about the three levels. You've got, the first thing you have is data, but then data should be analyzed and synthesized, and that becomes information. And that information is in a chart. But if you take information and you do further analysis and further work, you get intelligence. And intelligence is defined as that which drives decision making. So fundamentally, data in and of itself provides no value. It is about the intelligence. That's why artificial intelligence should help you make better decisions. Our job fundamentally at Greenpoint is to help our growers and our co-ops succeed. So what kind of data can we help them gather that we can layer into information that we can then turn into intelligence that's going to help that grower make better decisions at the field, that's ultimately going to help them be more profitable? I think they need help doing that. I call it Geek Squad for farming, right? And the folks that can bring that Geek Squad for farming, and that can build systems that will help bring that together and bring real insights and actionable intelligence to their growers, I think they're going to provide valuable services, and I would hope the growers reward them for doing it.
Interesting.
So I think that's one. I think the second one is, I think there's some promise around new technologies. You got biologicals out there. I think there's some growth opportunities there. I think there's some really interesting things on the carbon side of things. Again, I think the promise of this is really high, and I think the reality of it today is that it's in its infancy. But I think it has the potential, in my opinion, if we get this right, to be one of the biggest growth opportunities for growers and landowners in this country in a very, very long time, probably since the ethanol boom. I was talking to somebody about it the other day, and if you think about, this gets a little complicated, so forgive me, but if you think about a piece of land and you own it, you own the surface, and then you own potentially the dirt underneath, right? And all the stuff underneath it. And right now, a farm is valued based on its dirt and what it can produce, right? But at some point with carbon, it may be valued for what carbon is stored in the soil and its capacity to store carbon to help decarbonize our economy. And so that's a separate asset. And if the grower can get additional value for that asset because they're doing the right farming practices that will bring and store carbon in the soil, then more power to them. They're more successful, land is more valuable, and we help them be more successful. And again, they're going to need some help in figuring out how to make that happen.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a very different model. If you think about your farmland as an asset class versus something that is productive in nature versus you monetize through almost a reservoir type model where it appreciates over time because of the aggregate amount of carbon you might look to sequester. And, you have obviously the challenges with additionality and, people being incented for new good behaviors. Folks that have maybe not have done no-till farming for decades, maybe don't get to participate.
Sure.
And you have the permanence or durability challenges with, how long is that carbon likely to be there before a new owner or some other change in the future then basically recarbonizes the atmosphere. But absolutely, I think a huge opportunity. I think it's important that we all understand too that we're in that process now, kind of the post big froth of a lot of energy and excitement, and we're going to do this, and it's going to revolutionize, it's going to disrupt. As much as I hate that term, it's going to disrupt the industry. And now we're realizing that it's hard, but there's folks that are actually getting traction. And that's the important piece. Is not that everyone's promises didn't live up, it's that we're finding traction, and solving hard problems takes time. But when you solve the hard problem, it has outsized impact. So I'm with you, Jeff.
Yeah, I think there's the opportunity in the industry is that the industry's got to really work together, and you got to bring the whole supply chain. That's really hard to do, right? Because what you're really trying to ultimately do is put money in the grower's pocket, and it needs to go there, by the way. It's most important that the farmer gets paid for these practices that benefit the earth, and they get paid. And then obviously those of us who help provide that need to get paid, you got to be able to pay everybody along the value chain, but we all got to play by the same rules. Right now, what everybody's trying to do is set up their own thing, as opposed to sort of really working together and bringing the value chain together. I would say there's some stuff that we're working with and some companies we're working with that are really trying to do that. And the folks that can really start to do that, I think will help. The challenge is everybody wants to make it proprietary, right? Hey, we want to have a Greenpoint solution that's unique to Greenpoint that everybody, so then you're sort of locked into Greenpoint. It's not going to work. Right? I think if you're a grower, first, we got to recognize that growers often use more than one supplier, right? They don't put all their eggs in the Greenpoint basket. They're not going to put all their eggs in the Nutrient, Egg Solutions basket or Helen or Simplot or whoever, right? They're going to use multiple suppliers, and they want optionality. Anybody who's been successful in business for a long time has been so because they didn't put themselves into a corner where they only had one option. And so why would we want to put our growers in that position? So we want to, in my mind, and what I keep advocating for, is a much more systematic approach. Hey, let's create the standards, and then let's go compete like heck for their business on how we service them, right? And the advice we give them, and that ultimately benefits the grower and ultimately benefits us in the supply chain.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
Well, there's an interesting tie there too. We're talking about interoperability. I can try it again a couple more times. I get it wrong every time, but you know what I'm trying to say. Between a standard from which solutions are then derived, which then can be used by a producer regardless of who they're using as their supplier base. It's the same challenge you just mentioned with the tech stack and all these really interesting ag tech solutions that are being brought to market, where the integration friction is the actual challenge, where you have a variety of different parts of the farm operation feeding different databases, providing some really interesting, generating data, providing some information, and maybe even tipping into intelligence, but the opportunity lost by them not operating in tandem and in an integrated way. So I think there's a theme here around, supporting our collective innovations and investments in the space, but also remembering that if we're going to have the benefit accrue to the farmer, and then via them benefiting the ag supply chain writ large, also deriving benefit, you got to play together. No one's going to corner the market on innovation and tech and carbon sequestration. That's not how it's going to play out.
Yeah, I don't think so, right? I mean, I think that is the fantasy in the tech world, which is, hey, I'm going to be the first mover advantage and I'm going to become the Facebook or I'm going to become Twitter or whatever the major platform is. I'll get that entire platform and then I'll grab the scale that nobody else can make up for it. I get in the tech world. I don't think that's how it plays out in the ag space. And I think everybody trying to do that, it sells well probably when you're looking for investors. But I think from the reality in our world of all of the different competitors out there, that it's going to be hard to do. So I think we've got to figure out the industry way to help solve this. I think the other piece of it and coming back to your question on growth, is around services. Right now, our industry, it's challenged, and I came from a different industries that had the same challenge, which is we like to put the price of our services into the price of our product. Right. So we charge you, we put a huge markup on the product so that all the services that we provide, we basically give those away, or we do them at a very steep discount that may be operating at a loss. So take fertilizer, for example, it takes me a fairly hefty cost. I got to buy a $500,000 machine. I got to pay a guy and I got to pay a tender truck and a driver. So I got 2 drivers, 2 trucks, several $100,000 worth of equipment. I'm going to take it out to your field and I'll quote, give it to you for free, but I'm going to upcharge the price of fertilizer. So you see it all wrapped in. That sounds really great until somebody comes along and says, hey, I'm not going to apply it. I'll just pick it up, and wants to drop the price. Your farmer comes to you and says, well, can you match this price? And what he really wants is the price with the services at the same price. And people, if you're tempted to say yes, you just do it at a loss. So when you get into the services, it's recognizing the value of services and what we provide, and then having the conversation with the grower around what that actually costs us to serve. And then the grower has a choice, right? Some of these big growers, they don't need our services as much, and they're going to need a more competitive price. And other ones are going to want more services and need to pay for it separately. But we wrap all that together too often, and we aren't having those, what I would call the cost to serve discussions with the growers. The reality is our growers need us to be successful, right? Mm-hmm. We need our growers, and there's no questions asked. But our growers need us too, because if we're not working well, they don't have the right product at the right time. They don't get their field serviced, and they've got some challenges, right?
So it makes perfect sense, and it plays out in many different aspects of life and business. But in this context, where's the reluctance to have that conversation? Do we inherently discount the value of services that we provide? Is that a confidence issue? Is it that we've never penciled it out in a rigorous way? Is it that there's just this momentum now? We've been doing this many, many years and we're uncomfortable changing. What do you see as being a barrier to actually sitting down and having that conversation with a grower?
I think a combination of all three. I don't know if everybody's necessarily gone through and had that experience of having to have that conversation with the grower. I can tell you the first time, for me, the light bulb moment came on when I was working at a company called Orica. We were a manufacturer of commercial explosives, and we were losing millions of dollars at this site because we'd given away the services. Very similar structure, right? A very, very expensive machine. 2 guys go out there to the site and do all these services. And ultimately, we were wrapped it into the price of the product. We, on a very big multinational bid, dropped the price of the product, and we're losing a ton of money. And I needed to go in there with our sales team and raise their price over 25% in a single year. And I was counting the minutes. We took an over-under about how many minutes it would take before they threw us out. But out of sheer desperation, I just sat there on the whiteboard and I said, here, let's just model out what it costs us to serve you. And we just went through labor. We talked about the maintenance and the gas, the fuel, the drivers, everything it cost. And we just walked through the several different factors, put it all up there, and realized it was costing us about $2,000 a day to service their site. And we were charging them nothing. And their response was, well, why wouldn't you charge us something? And we said, Bill, because A, we hadn't thought about it in this kind of detail, and B, we were scared of losing the business. And so they said, well, we didn't know. We just thought you assumed, you would figure it out and done your own math. That's a fair assumption. I've had very similar conversations with growers, and they've said, well, why are you charging us so little? And it's sort of the same thing. First, we have to do the work ourselves. We got to train our salespeople. And then we got to have that courage. And again, I acknowledge it wasn't courage for me. I don't want to just sit there and tell you how brave I was. I was desperate. So desperation is what taught me the lesson. But now I'm a lot more confident in it because I know what the answers are as we walk through it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. And it's a good reminder too that courage could be desperation in disguise, and vice versa, right? So I think it's a point well taken. So Jeff, let's talk a bit about growth at scale. as a company gets larger, and this is true within the ag supply chain as well as outside of it, but as you get bigger, sustaining growth becomes harder. And it's for a variety of reasons. One, it's just the law of large numbers, right? Growing at 10% a year is easy when you're going from 1,000 to 11,000 and so on and so forth. But once you're a $1 billion company or bigger, it's just harder to maintain growth levels. But it's also more complicated because the business within the four walls becomes much more complex, right? You tend to build infrastructure around how you support your people. Your procurement department becomes more robust. The number and distribution of assets you operate becomes more complex. The way you underwrite and insure them, position risk, all these things just become much more complex. And so I'm always interested in how companies kind of, navigate that, and they find a way to preserve a culture of entrepreneurship and innovation, much like you all have right now, being kind of a startup, right? You're in your third year. How you maintain that culture, but also do it given the fact that as you get bigger, things will get more difficult and challenging to operate. And so how do you look at that challenge generally, or specifically at Greenpoint? How blending the innovation and entrepreneurship with just managing a complex organization?
Yeah, I think, a couple of things. We certainly don't have it nailed. We are absolutely learning as we go. I was actually spent last week, we call it advisory committees. We have some hourly employees that come together, and we have some site managers, right? And we try to get detailed feedback. So we sit down, our leadership team sits down with them for a full day with each one of them and just really gives them an opportunity to tell us how things are going. And, we got some pretty, I'll call it direct and honest feedback. Once you build up a little bit of trust, they tell you how it's going, or it's, in a lot of ways, how it's not going, right? And we have a lot of opportunities. And I think they were sort of getting right at the very question, which is, for me, it's around, you are only as good as your process, right, for growth. You are only as good as sort of the speed of which you can do things and repeat things over and over again. And yet we've got 90 locations of company-owned retail. And I joke that we're doing 95 different things, right? And so some of them are doing it really, really well. And they're just incredible. And those operations are humming. And we've got some others that are really struggling. And so how do we operationalize the behavior that's happening that's making those sites that are successful, and bring them those lessons to those guys who might be struggling? But if you're the guys, but yet at the same rate, everybody's like, so when you do that across the business, what happens is everybody feels like this is sort of this top down, right? You're just jamming process down my throat. And process, for a lot of folks, it's gotten a bad word in business because process means slow. Oh, well, I can't go to this until I do A, B, C, D, E, and F. But if you do process right, think about it much more like a football team playbook. If all the players went out there and every time you had a huddle, you had to draw the whole play up from scratch, how well would everybody execute it? And the answer is terribly. You have SOPs in the standard operating procedures in the military. And what I learned is the best military units, they have them, they practice them, and they execute them at a high degree of precision very quickly, very, very well every time. And what it matters is because when you get into something where it's slightly different, you only have to change something slightly. So you say, hey, that play, but we're going to, instead of going left, we're going to go right. And everybody goes, got it. Yep. Versus, well, we're going to have to throw the whole thing out and make it all up. And we've had a bunch of sites that have been working really hard and largely independent to solve these problems themselves. And now we got to help them solve them and pick out the best answers and do it. It's difficult, and to try and do it while people feel like they have the autonomy to still be responsive at the local level and do what the local market demands. I think that's the strength of a strong retailer, is they're very, very attached to their farmers and their local market, while also leveraging that size and scale. Yeah, it's very, very difficult. I think it starts with culture. I think, what the heck does a CEO do all day, right? At the end of the day, I'm not running around. I don't sell anything, right? I always joke, I don't do anything, right? I'm not out there. By the way, I'm a recovering lawyer. The last person you want to give agronomic advice is me, right? I'm pretty decent with a couple house plants, but beyond that, boy, that's not my job. But my job is to help build the culture where people feel comfortable with that, to get the right leadership in place, to focus on leadership. I think it's about, we've got to do a better job of listening to what's going on out in the field and having them feel empowered that when they've got an idea to do something better, that somebody's heard it and can help support them in solving that, and then operationalizing that across the business. So if there are so many ideas, I'm a big fan of sort of the Toyota way. If you think about lean manufacturing, it's not super popular in the ag space, but if you're in the manufacturing space, lean manufacturing has been around for decades. There are a lot of principles I think that could apply to us. If people feel empowered when they see something, when they find a source of frustration, they can come forth with the idea, and their boss, instead of saying, hey, shut up and do it this way, is, hey, let's try and work on that. But importantly, once we put that into a process, we want to operationalize that across the business. That's a theory. We have a long, long way to go. I think the other piece for me that we're working hard on is what I call flipping the triangle. If you think about just visually the corporate pyramid, right? I get to sit at the top in my fancy corner office, which is not so fancy. And I get to just provide all these directives about how this ship is going to run. And it just kind of pardon my expression, but the shit rolls downhill. And by the time it gets all the way to the bottom, it's not just a little pebble, it's just a whole avalanche of it. And it just washes over everybody. And all you have is this sort of group of collective misery. And by the way, underneath that person is the customer at the bottom.
Yeah.
So let's flip the triangle over, right? We talk about servant leadership. So the first thing we focus on is exceptional customer focus. Then you focus on supporting the people who have the direct interaction with a customer every day. Who is that for us? The guys who are out there on the field, driving the spreaders, making the deliveries, our sales guys, our agronomists, our ag technology people who are out interacting with our customers every day, all day. What are the people doing underneath them, because our triangle's upside down, to support those folks doing it better? And ultimately, my job is to help support all those people who support everybody else. I always say when things are going right, I can come up with a strategy, but my job is really to, get people, more capital, or sort of get things unstuck along the way. That's if things are working really, really right. Again, we have a long way to go. But if we get that culture right, where people feel empowered to make decisions and have ideas and they can bring those to light, there are a lot of incredible folks out there doing some incredible stuff with some great ideas about how to do it. I think that's where you get that innovation comes from. If we're relying on the great brain of Jeff Blair all the time, we're in real trouble, because it's not that great and it doesn't have that many ideas. And the ones that are, some of them aren't really very good, and they need to be stopped quickly.
It's a good thing that you're sequestered in that fancy corner office for most of the day.
Yeah, it's a mess.
There's a couple of themes there, though, to draw out. So the way I define culture is just the way work gets done around here, right? And you can have very much more robust academic definition. But if you think about, what's the culture of how we manage performance and give feedback? They'll tell you how it happens. What role does the customer have in our culture? And they'll tell you kind of where they show up in those discussions around strategy, et cetera. But if one of the ways that work gets done and I want to go into the process standpoint, one of the things that we experience a lot of challenges with our clients, and a lot of this is in that kind of post M&A space where people are tired. They feel like they've kind of had to take the hill, and maybe things are calming down. And now we start to look at working differently, and they feel like they've already sacrificed so much, right? And it's another sacrifice. And it's the standardization of process that can really trigger folks for a variety of reasons. Again, one, fatigue. It could also be that they say, well, this is the way I do it. And if you're changing the way I do something, what does it say about me and my value to the company? So you get into those kind of personal emotional responses. But I think one of the problems, or one of the areas that we tip into generally, is when you get the process bug, you see the real value in standardization because it de-risks your business, because you know how work should happen. And so then it's no longer dependent on particular people. The challenge is, though, that you go past where standardization bears fruit. And so if companies, and I know I'm kind of on my soapbox here for a moment, but if companies say, we're going to focus on great process where it bears standardization only. So where's the things where we actually don't want creativity? When we are running our aged AR analysis and doing collections work, et cetera, we want to have a standard way that we understand people's current credit exposure, what we knew when we evaluated them as a counterparty, what we know about their business, what we know about their payment history, what we know about their future production needs. We want to have a standard way to pull the information together, but then we're going to have maybe a creative way for how we go in front of that grower and have an uncomfortable conversation. about, past due, for example. And I think what happens is we tend to take it all the way to the extreme where we standardize all those front end elements. And I'm just using this as an example. And then we also somehow, I've seen companies almost, dang near go to having a script for how you talk to somebody who's got a big piece of exposure to you. And kind of then you're beating the humanity out of the business.
I think you nailed it. In my mind, it's the back end work that we want to standardize because we're trying to be as efficient in the back end to free them up to spend more time with growers. So for example, if our sales guys are, writing down the orders by hand, they transmit them to somebody else who has to sort of write them down. It's chicken scratch. We've got some inefficiencies because we screw the order up. We get an unhappy customer, and you get to spend your day trying to figure out what the heck went wrong and how do we get the right stuff. And we're really sorry about all that. And we'll send the truck back out. That's not efficient. Yeah. If we get the process right for just getting the thing that's just getting the order in the system and delivered to that grower, then that salesperson and that agronomist or the ag technology can spend the time with the grower talking about the stuff that really matters, the super value add. Yes. So I think you're right. It's about core processes that are behind the scenes. And the difficulty is, I think, first, it doesn't feel that way. Any process, if you don't have any, that just feels like an imposition. And I get that. That is a cultural shift. And second, we've got to make sure we're addressing the right pain points. But I think if we flip that triangle, the people who should be bringing up the pain points are the folks that are driving with the customer, right? And they'll tell us. So if I imagine the pain point, well, my pain point, and again, we'll think about a traditional thing. If I'm a credit person, right? What's my pain point? Well, I got too many credit applications. Well, I'm just going to put more requirements on the business for fill out these 47 forms and da-da-da-da-da-da. Yeah. And okay, that's great. That makes my job easier. But I've put that burden more on the business. And so the business is, I can't spend time with the customer because I got to fill out all these forms. And I want to put everybody to work to say, how do we make that process the most efficient we can? How do we make it very customer focused so the customer's happy with it? And yet it's very efficient. We're not re-entering data. We're not writing stuff down and losing it. They don't have to ask them 47 times for the same thing every year. We make it efficient and make it a good system so we can spend more time doing the stuff that matters of adding value to the farm. Not fighting over credit applications.
And even worse, using your story there, even worse extreme example is when we take the complexity and we outsource it to the customer as well. And so if you take a blended approach of we're going to build good process where good process will drive value collectively, it'll automate the back office, it'll automate the stuff that doesn't require creativity or a human touch or critical thought. And we're also going to make sure we're building on processes that are solving a problem for the customers and building from the customer back. You get to a good spot. But, too often I've also seen where internally, as to your point, we build these big, robust, burdensome requirements. It just reeks of bureaucracy. And the credit team is putting it on the salespeople to collect. The salespeople then subsequently start to ask some of that of the customers. And we have outsourced our own self-induced complexity onto the people that we say we want to serve. And that's among the most destructive outcomes.
And I think it starts with, and this was a realization for me, I've talked about sort of flipping the triangle for a while, and I realized really last week that the light bulb went on, and I realized I've talked about it and I put it out there as a goal, and I'm like, well, what have I done from a concrete step? What actions have I taken to make that a reality within the company? And the answer was, woof, there's some soul searching going on internally here this weekend. It was like, hope's not a method, right? So we got to get after it. But I think if we put, and I was talking to Joey Caldwell, our senior vice president of retail, and he was real one. He was like, but if we put the customer first, then the question you ask yourself with every change you're making out there is, how does this benefit the customer? Yes. Or how does it benefit the person who's serving the customer directly? And if we can't easily answer that question, then I think we have to rethink what we're doing.
A question that we often ask too, because sometimes I think it's a good question, but it also, you can start to wrap yourself into the form of a pretzel to kind of come up to an answer that's compelling, that convinces you that it's a benefit to the customer. But if you also ask, why would the customer be excited to hear about this change? That also can provide some pretty big breakthroughs. If you're actually saying, what do we have to do for the customer to say, well, dang it, Jeff, that's a great idea. I wish you guys had done it 10 years ago. I mean, that's the heck of a threshold to have to hit.
Look, there are some things, obviously the backside, there's just process. You need to bring some to it, and there's at scale. And, you can't, if everybody, all 90 locations decide they're going to go order their own thing and they're all going to call their own suppliers, well, then what's the benefit of having 90 locations working together? It doesn't work that way. Everybody understands that at some level. The question is just, how do we make it efficient? It's a journey, right? And I think The key to me is the conversation I'm having with you, we have to have internal and recognize that there's going to be a tension between the two because they compete with each other. And we have to get comfortable with that tension existing. And a lot of people want to eliminate it altogether. And I don't think you do it very effectively. You can't swing the pendulum one side or the other, right? And you often see companies that'll say they have a leader that comes in, particularly in public companies, right? The leader comes in, they're like, we're just going to M&A the crap out of everything. And they just buy everybody. There's no process. You just bolt everything on and it's sheer chaos. And eventually the wheels fall off the bus. They fire that person. They bring in a new person who's very process oriented. They consolidate everything. They've got all the process. They get the thing humming along, but they don't want to grow anything. And then pretty soon you got stagnant growth. Well, okay, fire that guy. Bring in the next one. And we just go in and out and in and out, right? This life cycle. Hopefully we don't have to do that. We can do both, right? And I go back to smart growth, smart inorganic growth, drive organic growth while we're trying to build a culture that recognizes that tension and is trying to strike a balance between the two.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. Well, Jeff, I'm looking at the time and we've taken the hour that you gave us. And given the fact that it's the second hour that you gave us, I don't want to be too cavalier with your time. So I want to say thank you, but how can folks learn more about Greenpoint Ag and maybe get in touch with you?
Yeah, I'm sort of a LinkedIn guy. I was writing up to about 6 months ago. I was writing weekly. I still write every single week to our company internally. I just stopped sort of putting them on LinkedIn for a while. Mainly I got distracted with some other stuff. It's one of my New Year's things is to restart. So there's one on LinkedIn. I would say greenpointag.com. Obviously we're there. You can learn a lot about our culture and that kind of stuff. We're pretty active on social media. We've got a great marketing team that's gone out there and done that. And, if you're in the Southeast, obviously come find us. We're around. We've got a pretty dense organization, AFC co-ops, TFC co-ops. If you're in Alabama and Tennessee, use those guys. So we're out there. Hopefully you can find us. If you can't, reach out to me, and I gotta make sure you can find us.
Very good. And I will say to our listeners who are going the distance and still with us, Jeff's newsletter was and will be, again, because I'm looking at Jeff and putting pressure on him. It's a great self-reflective perspective from a thoughtful leader who's thinking about not just what is the business trying to accomplish, but what's the ways in which you do it and what's the impact you have on people, both in the community, your customers, your suppliers, your employees, your family. And so one of the reasons I was really excited to have Jeff on 2 times now was to get that perspective in the room. So thank you, Jeff, for taking the time with us today and having the conversation. We could have gone for another hour, but really appreciate what we got.
Absolutely. No, appreciate you. And thanks for doing it. And look forward to hearing from some folks.
Very good. Thank you, as always, to our listeners for tuning in today. Remember to like and subscribe to the Pacesetter Pod wherever you get your podcasts. And in addition to finding and following Jeff on LinkedIn, you can also find me, Joe Mosher. And if you want to explore how we can help your business better execute strategy or M&A, you can set up a call with me directly from our website at www.moshercg.com. Thanks for listening. Keep getting after the growth of your business and have a safe day.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.